All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us and for your interest in both Florida and the opportunities for the carbon removal economy in Florida. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's program, which will start with introductions and a short presentation from me about the economic opportunity in Florida. But the majority of our conversation will be with our panelists. That's Patty Estridge from Seaweed Generation and Brian von Herzen from Climate Foundation. Thank them both so much for joining us today and for sharing their knowledge and insight. So the ocean economy, what we're going to be talking about today, includes a diverse range of economic activities that directly or indirectly make use of the sea. And that's a little bit distinguished from the blue economy, which really highlights the sustainability and the resourcefulness of the way that we use the ocean in the ocean economy. So it really has an impact on the long-term sustainability of the blue economy. And so today, Florida's economy is so tied to the ocean, right? We have over 8,000 miles of coastline. It's the second largest coastline of the United States. And the ocean brings in a lot of money for the state. The economic value of Florida's coastal communities is around $800 billion. And those counties represent 77% of the state's GDP. Indirect and direct use of the ocean totals at almost $75 billion. And that creates over 1 million jobs supported by the ocean and coastal resources. So obviously a massive economy in the state. There's no denying that. And that economy is really made up by maritime industries. So that includes all the shipping, the maritime transportation, and the major ports that we have in Florida. It also includes aquaculture. So there are over 1,000 farms in the state that produce shellfish and shrimp and ornamentals. Obviously, tourism is a huge one. It's a big reason why people come to the state for beaches and fishing and the wildlife available through the Everglades. And lesser known is actually research and development. The state has excellent research hubs for marine science, technology, and engineering. And we can see the impact of those industries. There are 4.3 million shipping containers that are processed through Florida ports. 40% of all maritime trade with Latin America goes through Florida. We also have over 19 million cruise ship passengers disembarking in Florida in the past year. And that contributes to $6 billion of value from tourism related to coral reefs alone, and over 70,000 jobs. So just a massive economy in South Florida. But that is not the limits to what we can do in the state. Of course, there are always opportunities for future growth. And that's really the goal of the newly minted Office of Ocean Economy that's going to be led at FAU. It's a consortium or an effort led by a consortium of all the public universities in the state. And it's really focused on advancing the economic uses of the ocean and coastal resources with a focus on sustainable practices that benefit the long-term outlook of relevant industry sectors and creating that competitive positioning of the state in the global economy. So the state is really focusing on what is the next chapter in Florida's economy, and that's looking at sustainability. And a few areas for strategic growth that the state is focusing on are renewable energies. That's any ocean-based energy solution, whether it's wave and tidal energy. It's also looking at advanced maritime technologies, including navigation, safety, and logistics. It'll also include biotechnology, that's pharmaceuticals, food production, and other bioproducts, as well as educating the workforce and broadening the development of our skill set in the state. But the state does not come without its challenges and threats. We are at the very forefront of climate change, and those can be physical and biological threats. So that might be storm surges and flooding, like the massive amount of flooding that we saw earlier this month in Miami and South Florida. It can include coastal erosion, which is interrupting the value of tourism and infrastructure along the coast. Uh, we're also experiencing uh, biological decline and ecosystem harms from coral bleaching, from coastal degradation. The state is also experiencing sargassum blooms and fertilizer runoff that are causing harmful algal blooms that also interact with folks on the coast and their property value. Just in 2022, because of Hurricane Ian, we experienced $100 billion in damages from that one hurricane alone. And the sargassum cleanup effort, that cost us $35 million. Over 400 miles of coastline have been critically eroded, and anywhere between 70 and 90% of Florida's coral reefs have declined since the 1970s. That's a global trend, and we're also seeing it really enhanced locally if you were following the bleaching of last summer. So where do these threats tie into the opportunities for a blue economy? And that's really in threat mitigation. That's a key part of the economy that doesn't really currently exist that companies are looking to tap into. What are these opportunities where we can actually service the public by reducing the threat? And that's where ocean carbon removal comes in, what we're here to talk to you about. Carbon removal is the process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and safely storing it in the ocean. There are a few different pathways for doing this. Blue carbon includes restoration of natural coastal ecosystems that hold a lot of carbon, that might be salt marshes or mangroves. There's also seaweed cultivation, which our guests can tell you lots about today, which is harvesting of seaweed for various uses, and algal sinking and burial, which is taking algae that might otherwise decompose and release carbon and actually storing that either in the deep ocean or underground where it can't decompose. There are also methods that are directly linked to ocean chemistry or physics, such as ocean upwelling, ocean alkalinity enhancement, and electrochemical ocean capture, which we can also get into later in the presentation. Oops. So the potential for this industry cannot be understated. Currently, the ocean captures about 30% of our carbon emissions, and the cap on that really is more chemical. So there are some impacts from acidification, which we're experiencing, but by safely enhancing the ability of the ocean to capture carbon, we can actually elevate that to about 10 billion tons, so 10 gigatons of carbon by 2050, and even doubling that by the end of the century. For some perspective, the total amount of anthropogenic carbon emissions in the atmosphere right now are about 40 billion tons or 40 gigatons. So the ocean has the potential to capture about half of our anthropogenic emissions by the end of the century, which is just a huge percentage of the work that needs to be done to curb emissions. And what that means in terms of value in the industry is about $1.2 trillion. That's the value of the CDR industry by 2050. A big portion of that will be going directly towards the buying and selling of carbon credits. So There's obviously a huge market opportunity here. This has been investigated by Bloomberg and by McKinsey and several other market analysis that by the middle of the century we'll be experiencing a rapid amount of growth in the carbon removal market. And the economic benefits are not the only ones that we'll see from this technology. That there's also the potential for local benefits, not just the local economy, but of course, environmental benefits that come with removing that carbon. There's both the opportunity to curb climate change and reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but there are also co-benefits to blue carbon solutions, such as protecting coastal biodiversity, water quality, and critical marine habitats by restoring those carbon sinks. Through seaweed cultivation, we can really enhance sustainable food products, as well as biofuels and fertilizers that are a byproduct of seaweed cultivation. And with algal sinking and burial, we take a lot of that sargassum that can emit toxic gases as it degrades on beaches and find a better storage solution or disposal solution for that harmful algae that's washing up on our shores. Of course, with artificial upwelling, we see enhanced marine productivity. Ocean alkalinity enhancement reduces the impacts of ocean acidification, as does electrochemical ocean capture. And the revenues of these technologies can actually offset a lot of the costs of mitigating these local challenges. Carbon credits are sold to buyers who want to either offset or reduce their carbon emissions, and that can fund projects that would usually come out of taxpayer dollars or through private funding mechanisms. And when we look at the states that are leading, that have a positional advantage in this industry, states like Texas and Louisiana are really forging the path for terrestrial carbon sequestration technologies. And this competitive advantage has kind of set them apart in a way that we could do in Florida, while also having benefit to the ocean economy. So not just looking at terrestrial burial of CO2, which is often in conjunction with oil industry, we can grow the local ocean economy through these technologies. And so now we're going to open up the conversation to our panelists with Brian von Herzen and Patty Estridge to talk about the ways in which they're using this technology to boost the ocean economy.
Oh, great. Laura, can you hear us a little bit? You just went a little silent.
Oh, I can hear you.
You're good. Great. Great to be here.
Yes. Greetings, Laura.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. Let's just start with some introductions. Patty, would you mind telling us about yourself and what you do with seaweed generation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So hi, everyone. I'm Paddy. I'm CEO of Seaweed Generation, and we're building automated robotics to work with seaweed in the ocean. Most notably for this panel, we build the algal array, which is like a Pac-Man meets a Roomba for sargassum blooms, which we think, obviously, given that it's a really big issue in Florida, has a lot of potential for the, use in the state. So the algal array hoovers up sargassum and can either sink it into the deep ocean or take it to land to be disposed of. And it's designed to be an automated system that works in a swarm with other algal arrays. So when it's fully developed, it should be able to remove and control lots of sargassum, which is quite a significant problem.
Could we just pause there and acknowledge how absolutely cool that is? I don't know, robots that grab sargassum. And Patty, certainly if you have any image that you would want to pop up at some point, it's easy to do here. So.
Sure. Okay, I'll investigate.
Sure.
And Brian, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us what you do with.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, I'm the executive director at the Climate Foundation, which is a startup studio that focuses on being a golden goose that lays golden eggs, and that is sustainable marine businesses and value chains and enterprises that can actually help to realize the blue economy and the ocean economy in the years ahead. Seaforestation.co is one example of our golden eggs, and that is helping to regenerate the primary productivity of the tropical oceans, including Florida waters.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. So as we get into this topic, one of the first questions is, what is the role of science and innovation in the ocean economy? What stakeholders stand to gain from the expansion of science-based ocean companies? Brian,
That's a great question.
I think given your experience as a startup studio, we can lead the way on this question.
Yes, I think the science world, both academic and industrial, applied science and engineering, has an opportunity to help foster the kind of technical innovation, for example, the robots that Patty's working on, to build sustainable innovations that can be turned into sustainable small businesses and ultimately grow and build the economy. So it is, in many ways, the engine of creation of a healthy economy are the technologies and small businesses that can be created with the support of the state and academic and industrial service sector.
I'll add to that a little bit. So, I mean, I agree. I think it, like Brian says, it is the engine. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is there is a lot to be developed here that needs some ingenuity, needs some development, needs some new innovation to take it forward. And from a scientific perspective, it's extraordinarily important that we have the buy-in and the support and the endorsement of scientists to, one, make sure that everything that's being done in the ocean is being done in a way that is as sustainable and as beneficial as possible. And secondly, to make sure, especially when it comes to something like marine CDR or large-scale seaweed cultivation, or really anything that's done in a large scale in the ocean, it's being done in a way where we're trying as much as we can to understand the consequences and either decide that those are acceptable or indeed maybe even prove that they are beneficial. And that's a massive opportunity that we are probably past on land, but in the ocean we're still early enough to really kind of try and do it right.
Yes, that's a great point, Patty. I think what we're learning around the world today is that it's community-led projects that will ultimately have the social acceptance that's needed to really thrive. And that's where there's an opportunity for community leaders to really step in and say, we want the ocean economy here, and we're going to streamline our regulations. We're going to work and co-design. I think many times entrepreneurs such as myself and Patty have the opportunity to co-design solutions that are customized for communities that want to achieve particular objectives. And that's where we're seeing the greatest social acceptance that I think will actually lead the way towards really developing healthy weather conditions, healthy oceans, and healthy seas for ourselves and our children.
And coming in on that point about the social acceptance, a big part of gaining social acceptance is proving these or validating these co-benefits. When you think about what's needed to demonstrate that and de-risk these technologies and prove those co-benefits, what kind of resources do you need to be able to accomplish that, to do that science?
A tremendous amount of data, I think, is probably the first thing we need. And it's something that we at Seaweed Generation have started to develop in conjunction with the robots. First, because you need lots of data to be able to autonomize anything. And then secondly, if you're doing that type of work, then you may as well get a lot of information. And that's in the oceans, it's not very dense, the data that is being gathered. So being able to be able to deeply understand what is going on in a particular area and in the area surrounding those things will take a lot of monitoring and a lot of information being gathered and processed. And I think AI has a really big role to play in processing all of that information and in understanding what it means, or helping us to understand what it means. But right now, the information that's available in the ocean space and water spaces as well is quite thin on the ground in most places.
Patty, just on that, that is a very heavy lift, and what you're describing there is quite expensive and technically difficult to pull off. It's a heavy lift for startups to obviously do by themselves. So where are there sources of data or institutions, either governmental or otherwise, that are starting to fill in some of those gaps that make your job easier, I guess?
There are some. I mean, we're in the golden age of satellite imagery and spatial observation, which really helps. And I think from our perspective, everything that is done, or most things that are done in the ocean at the moment, are extremely expensive. And there is some form of democratization, grant funding, local community funding, and innovation that can, and I think will, bring the price of those types of observations down, especially at a large scale.
Yeah, Patty's right about the need for data with respect to applied science and engineering. I think we're living in a drone revolution, and in many ways, I just bought a drone yesterday with a 1 hour duration. You can go many kilometers out to sea, survey, collect data, and come back, and that costs orders of magnitude less than sending a boat. Or the satellites are good too, and I think there could be an opportunity for the state of Florida to have a satellite database it can work with. NOAA has been working on undersea databases as well, and those should be made readily available to the public and to entrepreneurs. So there's a good opportunity there. I'm going to add that an essential part of the infrastructure that's needed is everything that's needed to cross what we call the valley of death between the basic science and the commercial realization. And that includes the applied science, the engineering, the connection with first customers, the development of product market fit, and ultimately the scaling that will enable those enterprises to be launched and to succeed and sustain. So there's a whole infrastructure associated with this development. I think that's perhaps equally important to the data and technology.
That's a really excellent point that I think right now in the field of ocean carbon removal, a lot of people are thinking about what is a science project and what is a field trial to gain scientific insight versus what's a location for long-term operation and really delivering these carbon credits for a commercial use. So how do you think about finding these locations and where to operate in the long term? What are some factors that you think about? And how might Florida position itself to be on the short list of places where this is really feasible for long-term operation?
Brian, would you like to start?
I'd be happy to, Patty. Florida has really unique geography, and I think it's important to recognize and utilize those ocean resources. For example, did you know that the city of Miami is just 24 miles from deep water? And this is deep, cold water. I mean, we're talking like below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, very deep, good supply of nutrients. And it's amazing as a cooling technology and a supply of deep nutrients. I think the key to solving most of Florida's problems are accessing resources that people don't fully appreciate today. The Florida Keys, the same thing, just a few kilometers from deep water. And those could actually rescue coral reefs. So there are huge opportunities here. And to quote some of our colleagues who've been in the carbon industry over time, we want to build sustainable businesses. The challenges we face today with weather and changing conditions are food security on land and sea. And so it starts with food, feed, and fertilizer products that can actually help to sustain our food security, because I'll tell you, no civilization has survived a collapse of the seas and the soils. And our challenge and our opportunity is to keep the oceans alive and keep the soil microbes alive that can actually ensure healthy food production and a healthy economy. Then on the way to doing all that, we can measure the carbon removals and the reduced emissions. So while we're ensuring sustainable livelihoods and food security for our civilization, we can also measure those carbon removals. They're going to be part of it. For example, when we grow seaweed offshore, a quarter of it falls off our platforms during growth, sinks 1,000 meters a day to the deep seafloor where it remains for centuries. And that's a huge opportunity to say, well, yeah, we're going to count the leaves falling from the tree as we're growing the food that's going to actually sustain the ocean and our planet.
Mm-hmm. So, to summarize that, when you think about operations and when you think about location, Florida's geography and really taking advantage of underutilized resources is key. Patty, what do you think of that when you look at locations for long-term operation and when you're thinking about, just proof of concept science? What factors are you weighing?
So I mean, really similar. In our case, it would be we'd be thinking more about the cost of cleanup of sargassum, the co-benefits that could be achieved by preventing that from happening, and that's going to benefit ecologies. It's going to benefit fisheries. It's going to benefit mangroves, coral reefs, and areas that don't get poisoned by the sargassum. And just as Brian said, whilst we're on our way to carbon dioxide removal and being able to understand and really quantify all of those different things, there is the defense of ecosystems and channeling some of that funding and that cleanup cost into innovation that can lead into a different place. And I think, for a startup like ours, I suppose the co-benefits are, or the other things that kind of come with the carbon dioxide removal are actually the thing that will be immediate term catalytic. And then longer term, we'll have a greater understanding of CDR, the chemistry and longevity and everything around that.
Patty, just a quick question too. I understand that your seaweed generation is doing trials or aiming to not too far away in the region, right, in the Caribbean. Is that correct? Just to kind of place what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so we've done a small scale pilots, and mostly to prove the functionality of the algal ray in the Caribbean. And we're working with quite a few different Caribbean nations, or we're in conversation with quite a few Caribbean nations tourism industries to try and reduce the amount of sargassum that is hitting the beaches and making people's holidays unpleasant and reducing bookings, putting people off visiting, really.
Great. Laura, we do have a question here, which is a good one, pretty fundamental one that Brian, you just sort of alluded to when you talked about seaweed sinking thousands of meters. Cade, who's not too far away in Puerto Rico, actually has this question here. If we introduce some biomass or a lot of it in the waters deeper than, say, 1,000 meters, what is the fate of that stuff? And also, that doesn't know that there's too much deep water that close to Florida. So kind of, Brian, if you want to elaborate a little bit more about what you kind of sketched out about the seaweed falling, what exactly is happening there?
Yes. Well, first of all, we should recognize that Florida is a big ocean state. I mean, not only is there 8,000 miles of coastline, but there's 200 miles out is the exclusive economic zone. So just multiply that huge area. It probably rivals the area of Florida itself. So what can we do in those state waters? I mean, that's the exclusive economic zone of the United States, but it's adjacent to Florida. The important thing is to recognize that, first of all, in the tropics and subtropics, the ocean has gotten much warmer. And that has actually put a lid on natural upwelling, which has limited the nutrient supply for microalgae and macroalgae, across the oceans. And the challenge is to actually restore natural upwelling to keep the primary production of fish food and fish habitat that can keep the fisheries alive. So it's a real challenge. And we first have to recognize that the subtropical oceans around the world have seen decreases of productivity of 30 to 40% in just the last 60 years. So our first challenge is, can we just get back to pre-industrial levels of productivity? And that is to restore the supply of deep nutrients. Now, the questioner is right. There's a huge amount of blue ocean. That's probably 99% of the subtropical ocean that's out there. And the problem is the water is too warm and the nutrient levels are too low at the surface, at least offshore. Near shore, you might have some eutrophication. But offshore, the problem is the ocean gets stratified and you don't get that natural upwelling that occurred pre-industrially. The challenge and the opportunity is to use enough renewable energy to restore the supply of deep nutrients and restore the primary production. And when that quarter of the seaweed falls off a platform or even off the sargassum, we find sargassum seaweed down 1,000 meters or more. That's actually feeding the benthic communities. And it's actually the food supply for those benthic communities that are critical, because without that marine snow, those benthic communities can't continue to survive. And that includes bottom fish and shrimp and all sorts of creatures from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic Ocean. So let's try to keep our ecosystem going. Our experience across the world is that if we can give nature half a chance, she'll rebound exponentially. And the challenge and the opportunity is to keep our oceans healthy by ensuring a continued supply of deep nutrients. You can go anywhere in the ocean, just go down 100 meters or 200 meters, and there's plenty of nutrients that will actually enable algae to grow and enable the primary production that's needed to keep the oceans alive and healthy. Thanks.
Just want to point out that Rob Bartnick in the comments is dropping some journal articles and made a comment earlier, which I love in terms of circularity. It looks like, if I'm reading that title correctly, he's sort of alluding, it looks like it pertains to maybe using sargassum as a feedstock for building materials. And he has a similar document here that seems to be about seaweed being used maybe as a biochar SCM in concrete. That to me is always really interesting, if you can get value out of a waste product and remove carbon at the same time. So as a sargassum person, Patty, I didn't know if that's something that you've looked at, beyond sinking. Is there stuff you can do with it?
Yeah, we looked at it for about a decade. So my co-founder Mike is a professor at Exeter University, and he's been working with a research team in Mexico for since about 2011, and has been working on every possible thing that you could do with a sargassum. He's turned it into biocrude, plastics, char, loads of things. We actually have tried to turn it into bricks. The not issue, but the reason why that isn't done on a big scale yet is that it hasn't been possible to add enough sargassum to make a difference to most products. The streams of extraction, the fresh water, the power that you need to turn sargassum into something valuable makes it quite difficult to make the economics work. I'm not saying that the only thing that you could ever do with sargassum is sink it, but as such an enormous problem, you could probably make some bricks, make some face moisturizer, make a few other things, and still have plenty left over for carbon dioxide removal. So I don't think it's a either or thing. It's the problem needs to be dealt with.
Yeah.
And there's a large quantity of it to deal with.
Mm.
That's a great point, Patty. In fact, one of our colleague companies is making sea bricks in the Pacific Northwest, and there's no reason that couldn't be done in Florida as well. But it's the essential thing is to keep the sargassum from rotting, because if it rots, it turns into methane. And methane has got 80 to 120 times the greenhouse gas potential warming of CO2. And so there's plenty of cellulose and hemicellulose in sargassum and other seaweeds. And the challenge and the opportunity is to find some good uses for it. There's plenty of uses, and in fact, multiple uses for a single stream of sargassum seaweed. And components can be used for sea bricks, for construction, in a variety of applications. I was even connecting with some colleagues in Europe who want to use the seaweed to make furniture. In fact, I think the world's first seaweed chair is on display in Singapore as we speak.
It also lets out hydrogen sulfide, which is very bad for anything that breathes. So it gets pretty nasty when it rots. It's something that it should be avoided.
Right. I think that can be avoided as long as you keep it not so keep it in an oxygen environment, and that's a key to actually reducing it. A lot of seaweeds have sulfur. Sulfur's common in the ocean, and it does need to be managed, just as we have to manage sulfides in wine production.
Mm-hmm. And Brian, I want to come back to something that you said a little bit earlier. You said if we give nature half a chance, that it'll rebound exponentially. And in Florida specifically, a lot of our I think a lot of the troubles that we're discovering now in the state started from messing with marine habitats and messing with the way water flows through the state. And there are arguments that say, we need to reverse that and that'll fix all of our problems. And then other arguments that say, well, we can't go back on all of that human and societal progress that we've made through engineering the state. And where do you see these technologies either as a mechanism to undo harm or to move forward and sort of adapt to the harm that's done? Where do we strike that balance?
I think the important thing is to understand it's not a zero-sum game. We've really pioneered the field of marine permaculture with colleagues such as Dave Holmgren, who's actually one of the fathers of permaculture. And we just did a paper last quarter in One Earth Journal as part of the Cell Journal series that actually covers applying the dozen permaculture design principles to the marine environment. Like it or not, we've changed the coastal marine environment. The challenge and the opportunity is to apply permaculture design principles, which means listen carefully, look at what the situation is today. Many inland waters are eutrophic. Can we grow some nice seaweeds and coastal, and algae and potentially harvest those and actually draw down the nutrient levels, keep a healthy environment that is actually habitat for fish? And that's a permaculture design approach that can actually help to fix the challenges that have been imposed in these coastal waterways, do a sustainable harvest, find the food, feed, and fertilizer products that can sustain that operation, and actually help to clean up those coastal environments. I think applying the dozen permaculture design principles to the coastal and marine environment is a huge opportunity, and it's something we've been working to pioneer with marine permaculture over the past dozen years.
We do have some good questions coming in. Laura, do you want to pause and put those up?
Sure, we can get into that.
So we have Josh, who's an OpenAir member and a Ocean CDR entrepreneur himself. This was a question I was going to ask for, is about, we know that Florida has good natural resources. We know that they're really focusing on ocean economy. At the more local level, there are sort of incubators and accelerators around climate tech. But I'm curious, Patty, from your perspective as a startup, and Brian is one who incubates startups, what is that other suite of factors that you would really want that would make for an ideal location? And I'll say one thing. Just yesterday, Massachusetts passed through its Senate a bill that OpenAir has been working on for a year and a half that provides supply side incentives for climate tech companies, including CDR companies, to locate there. And so that's tax breaks and a whole variety of things and proximity to universities. But from both of your perspectives, what makes for an ideal location beyond just the natural resources of a place?
Patty?
Oh, I think, like Brian said earlier, the geographical location is extremely interesting. You have a tremendous access on all sides of the state to water and to be able to get into the water and start to do activities there. It seems that the state is very open to innovation. There's a tremendous amount of talent in the state, and actually most of the people that I know in the US who are in automated ocean shipping or anything are in Florida already. So there's a lot of resource there already, and I think local communities as well. Like a lot of local communities in Florida are coastal, and that is tremendously important. It means that they can play a really key role in seaweed farming, helping to monitor and gather information, and really engaging with all of the different things that need to happen for CDR to be possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Patty. In addition, I spent 3 decades working in Silicon Valley and understanding everything that was needed to build the entrepreneurial environment that's been really, growing exponentially, I would say, for the past several decades. And I think there's an opportunity to Florida to provide the silicon seas of the ocean. And that can be everything from marine solar, which is being tested in Europe right now, to really bringing the innovation. But to do that, I'll quote one of my professors, Carver Mead from Caltech. We need to build the infrastructure that can support the startup environment. And that includes, it starts with the universities, but it has to extend to all the support that's needed to cross that valley of death through applied science and engineering, customer engagement, product market fit, and product rollout to commercialization. And that means having the legal infrastructure, the finance capacity, the investors, the angel investors and venture capitalists, the infrastructure that can really help to curate those organizations through what are some difficult years. But the great thing about those startup companies is they are the engines of creations for creating employment, jobs, sustainable industry. And the future is bright. I mean, Florida is a big ocean state. It has copious amounts of sunlight. And who's talking about marine solar? Not much so far. There's a huge opportunity to engage on this and really make it happen. It's going to require innovation. It's going to require customization to withstand hurricanes, to enable all the rest of it to go. But that's a huge opportunity for innovation as well. So I see that as being the key to building what I would call the Silicon Seas, if you will, instead of the Silicon Valley of Florida, that could really help to lead the way in transforming our economy from what may have been fossil fuels in the past to, let's say, the electric industry. I mean, Texas is quickly becoming the EV capital of the United States. What if Florida could become the EB capital, the electric boat capital of the U.S.? I mean, why not develop that, the conditions that are needed so that the electric boats that will power our future can actually, be developed right in Florida.
It's great. And Josh, don't be bashful. If anybody who's on the audience side of this is a ocean CDR entrepreneur and their company has a website, don't be bashful. Feel free to please share it in the chat. We do have a couple other questions, Laura. Do you want me to just hit those real quick and then we can go back to yours, or should we wait?
Yeah, I think before we move on from this topic, I want to mention two new sort of legislative initiatives that have passed in Florida. One is between a coalition of counties in South Florida. They've developed the South Florida Climate Ready Tech Hub. And that is exactly as you said, Brian, trying to establish a Silicon Valley of sorts in South Florida, but specifically for climate technologies. And so that includes coastal infrastructure. So the bill specifically outlines smart seawalls and biophilic coastal infrastructure. It's looking at alternatives and sustainable energy sources for air conditioning and alternate energy sources such as solar and wind. And so this is complemented also by a statewide initiative, not just county-led, but the Office of Ocean Economy, which we mentioned briefly in the presentation. That is set to open on July 1st. So there's a lot of opportunity to potentially work with the Office of Ocean Economy to develop their programming and their policy. But what it says is the state really cares about developing this sector of the economy. And there's opportunity to work with the state here.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And we did have a question, just to go out of order a little bit here, that I think kind of relates to that and the bigger theme of the Frauk. In this, we didn't even say at the beginning, Laura, that you are a Florida native and a CDR entrepreneur yourself. You know this state well, you know the landscape, and maybe you want to take the first crack at this one. But what are the greatest barriers to Florida becoming a marine CDR hub, and who is most active in the field right now? Individuals, companies, organizations. Beyond what you just shared, didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to share.
Sure. I think in terms of barriers, it's hard to ignore some of our legislative leaders and their thoughts specifically around climate change. Definitely politicizes the issue and creates some sort of delicate language when we're talking about climate change and how to address it in the state. But when you look at the lived experience of people in Florida and the topics that they care about and how they are sort of that competing mentality of maybe not being fully on board with the causes of climate change, but also deeply feeling the impacts of climate change, I see that there's a big potential for a paradigm shift and for the lived reality to really kind of outweigh that ideological um, part of state's identity. And so I think that is a challenge. And where there's active work to combat that is there's a lot of work being done in South Florida, which is, what I'm most familiar with. I grew up in Miami. Um, some key players would be Seaworthy Collective. They are a startup incubator in South Florida, um, but they accept companies from all around the world, and they've just grown tremendously in the past couple of years. So definitely look into Seaworthy Collective. There are also a lot of different um, hubs for research. So the Marine Research Hub of Florida is working with startups to actually conduct their research. We're also supported by a lot of academic researchers and nonprofits in the space. So uh, I can put together a list sort of afterwards to send out with this recording if that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah, we will send the recording to people who have attended. I also just want to give Frauke a shout out of those of you who have spent any time in the CDR space. Frauke is a lead scientist at Stripe and Frontier. So we're thrilled to have you join the call. But Frauke, we're also thrilled to hear you're moving to Florida. So you should definitely connect with Laura. Would be good to kind of really get all the CDR heads in the state, at least together for a happy hour and then more. So great to have you on.
To further answer Frauke's question, I think Laura has some really good points. And adding to that, some approaches to marine CDR can be controversial. I think the challenge and the opportunity is to work with solutions and work with communities and really identify customized solutions that can meet community needs, that we build community support by co-designing and developing sustainable approaches that sustain economy as well as help to regenerate healthy environments. And I think the opportunity is to have marine CDR be part of a larger sustainable ocean economy, if you will. And it's by finding those approaches that sustain coastal communities, that enable them to thrive, then we can also be thriving with respect to regenerating healthy ecosystems.
There's a few more questions, Laura. Do you want me to do those? They're actually quite good ones. So I want to thank the audience for giving us some stuff to think about. Let's actually go to this one because it was something that Patty actually alluded to before, but maybe could give us a little bit more detail. Laura and OpenAir members know that I use AI in very productive ways to generate legislation, and it can do almost anything. But I wonder if you could give us a little bit more detail about the role of AI in actually characterizing oceanic changes and how this technology could fit in.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple sort of main areas that we are starting to use AI for. The first is actually to help us get the data in the first place. If you're listening to marine life, you're recording video, that gets really big really fast, and you're not always capturing something worth keeping. So we're developing AI on the hardware side to decide whether or not to actually upload or keep pieces of data, which obviously we hope we don't lose lots of really interesting stuff, but it should mean that the data and the information that we're keeping is worth keeping. Then I think there's also a really huge role for therefore like recognition and what am I hearing, what am I seeing, kind of what's going on here. And then large language models we think have a tremendous amount of potential to take that data and make sense of it in a way that it would take a really long time for an individual to go through and start to look at what's actually going on. So the interpretation and categorization and reporting on information, we think will be really, really, really important.
Yes, adding to that, I would include the fact that, well, we've actually been really developing the use of drones to do a lot of remote sensing. In fact, we've written a proposal to NASA to use a combination of drone and satellites to actually image the seaweed platforms that we're developing offshore and monitor them on a daily basis. And when they can be monitored daily, we can actually take those images and feed them into a machine learning example. And we currently have a carbon cycling study going on in the Pacific Ocean. That's a 2-year program involving 4 universities from around the world, including a number in the US. And they are investigating the ground truth, the underwater carbon cycling. But if we can use those daily images in a machine learning model to actually estimate the daily growth rate and the daily fall off rate of the seaweed under various ocean conditions, that can actually inform a remote sensing model that can be trained on the ground truth data. And then ultimately, we can take those drone images and predict and forecast the daily growth rate and the fall off rates of these seaweeds under a variety of ocean conditions around the world. And we see that as a huge opportunity using satellites and remote sensing to do that. And AI is directly involved in developing the models that can, with training, actually estimate the daily seaweed growth and the daily fall off rates of the seaweed on the platforms.
Excellent. Well, we have 7 minutes left. This has been a great conversation, by the way. Really excellent. Thank you guys for sharing. Laura, you had some other excellent sort of prepared subjects, which we probably could hit on 1 or 2 more of those. And then there are, 1 or 2 more, good questions that we could end with. So didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to take the conversation towards.
Well, one part of the ocean economy that's been really of interest in Florida is how we retain talent, how we retain university students. So I'd like to ask if either of you would like to touch on, how your companies interact with academia and what are alternate pathways for young people who are interested in marine science or interested in the marine economy, but maybe don't see pathways outside of academia. What is your experience with this?
Patty?
So we work, we're based in the UK, so this is a UK phenomenon, but my co-founder Mike is still a professor at Exeter University 50% of the time. So we actually quite frequently take on interns and people who are doing industrial placements to seaweed generation to act as part of their education, I suppose. And then, that's just a fantastic hiring pathway for us. We have hired, I think, 2 people now out of that cohort. So I guess we're interacting very, very, very closely. But I suppose you either want to be able to have a role that you can have within the state where you've got companies that are being attracted and are hiring in the state, or you need remote roles that could be done in another place from Florida. But it's a tricky economic distribution question, I think.
Those are good points, Patty. Startup companies and small enterprises are the engines of creation when it comes to jobs and employment over time. They're really small enterprises and medium-sized enterprises are what create most of the jobs. The larger enterprises do mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations and actually reduce jobs. So the challenge is, how do we foster small business within the state? That requires building the infrastructure that's needed to build Silicon Valley of the oceans of, perhaps in Florida. And to do that, the infrastructure needs to be there, not only the basic science, but also the applied science and engineering, those technologies, the finance, the legal, the ability to actually curate and provide a safe space for small enterprises to strive and succeed or fail and be able to recycle and actually pivot and develop some really sustainable products. And I think there's a huge opportunity there that requires nurturing, really, the small enterprises, the innovation that can take place with a combination of state support and industry support and academic support. I think that's the challenge, and the opportunity is to build that critical mass of infrastructure that can really support small businesses growing in the state.
Yeah, we have a good question here that kind of makes me think of a larger question here, which I'll make sense of here. So we'll let the cat out of the bag, right, Laura? That this this discussion we're having today really is kind of a first outing to develop and grow interest in this idea of Florida really taking a lead. And so we're thinking through OpenAir is involved in a lot of policy advocacy as well as support of local projects through our sister organization, Four Corners Carbon Removal. And so I did put there, if you're interested in joining OpenAir, if you're in Florida or not in Florida, but would be interested in trying to help this along. So much of it is about building a network of the willing, of organizations that and individuals and businesses that get it and want to get it and want to play a role. And that's the formula for success. In CDR in general, we see that a lot of progress has been made, particularly on the environmental side, where you see more environmental organizations really sort of weighing in and playing a role. How would you characterize in ocean carbon removal the sort of reception, I guess, it's getting from organizations, and or any of the kind of the mainline or large ocean conservation or ocean environmental groups kind of all in on CDR, or at least curious about it? How would you kind of characterize the state of that at this point?
Well, I think it's developing. There are some leaders. The one that comes to mind is EDF. The EDF has actually focused on questions like marine CDR. I mean, there are three pillars, if you will, to getting to our healthy environment and ecosystems, and that is, emissions to zero, 1,700 gigatons of carbon removal, and we're going to have to do some environmental repair on the way to be able to manage hurricanes, to be able to manage other things that are getting worse, sea level rise. I mean, these are going to be critical aspects. I think when it comes to conservation, we need to evolve our organizations towards 21st century organizations. And that means moving beyond the 20th century principles of conservation and protection and really start talking about how do we restore and regenerate ecosystem services. Because if we can restore and regenerate, we're giving nature half a chance. She can rebound exponentially. And that's going to be the key to having the bounty that'll keep our civilization active and healthy with good food supplies and good ecosystem services.
I agree with that, absolutely. And to harp on the same thing I keep saying, there are lots and lots of, like Brian said, conservation thinking, which is mostly preventative, and it shifting that into optimization and more upside, I think, is starting to happen. But we need the data. We need to take the baseline information. We need to understand what things look like before you do anything, and then track that in different parts of the ocean ecosystem, the surface, the deep ocean, the coastal, and be able to very confidently say, this is good, this is having the desired impact. And I think that will bring everyone along. There's a little bit of, or quite a lot of, nervousness around unintended consequences. And that is completely fair given the experience that we are currently having. So to be able to move forward with confidence, we need to be able to understand what will happen when we do something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great points, Patty. And I want to add not only the unintended consequences of various interventions, but what are the unintended consequences of doing nothing? In other words, when we look at the alternative of business as usual, and we're looking at 101 degree temperatures off the Florida Keys and half the coral dying, in one summer, we need to really consider the unintended consequences of doing nothing and consider how we can actually work with the rest of nature to help regenerate healthy ecosystems and a healthy environment.
I think I'm so glad that we ended with that, and I'll hand it off to Laura to close. But I would say we see that everywhere, where there's certain sort of parts of environmental thinking or DNA that have to evolve. And it really does. We're in the Anthropocene, whether we like it or not. In order to save us, we have to intervene, and we have to activate what's best about humanity and our ability to actually adapt and change. And another thing we have to do is we have to look beyond red and blue politically. Obviously, to even have this conversation in Florida, you have to appeal to the local projects and what are the benefits and lead with that. And if we do that, we know we can be successful in Florida, because Florida is already innovating, and this is part of it. So it's all about what we associate this with, in a really authentic way. And I say that totally as a non-Floridian. So appropriately, I'm going to pass off to Laura to go ahead and end the webinar for us.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think that the state from the outside could seem very much divided between red and blue, but the experience of Floridians is that we all care about the unique geographies and the unique resources that we have around us. Florida is an incredibly beautiful state, and we all have different ideas about how to enhance and take advantage of that beauty. And I think that an important pillar of the ocean economy is both harnessing those resources and making sure that we preserve them so that they're around to benefit the next generation. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with carbon removal and with all, climate technologies. So I think that we have two excellent leaders among us. Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Brian, so much for sharing. You offer so much hope for the next generation. We really hope that we see you based in Florida very soon. And thank you to everybody who joined us today on this call for showing your interest in both Florida, the ocean economy, and in carbon removal. So please stay tuned in with OpenAir, with all of the work that we're doing in the state and with other states. I know that we got at least one comment with interest from Philadelphia. So OpenAir does work across the United States. So there are always opportunities to volunteer your interests and your time. So thank you all so much for being here. And we look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.